I invite you to join me in welcoming to Middlebury College Professor Christopher Marsh. Professor Marsh is Associate Professor of Political Science and Church-State Studies at Baylor University, where he also directs the program in Asian Studies. The Church-State Studies program is also about to celebrate its 50th anniversary, I understand, and there is a journal attached thereto, which will soon celebrate its 50th anniversary. Dr. Marsh completed his undergraduate and master's degrees at Central Connecticut State University and his PhD in political science at the University of Connecticut. He has held research appointments in Beijing and the Institute of the Far East and the Russian Academy of Sciences in Moscow. He maintains close research ties with the Institute on Culture, Religion, and World Affairs at Boston University, where he works closely with the eminent sociologist Peter Berger, and the Institute for Multidisciplinary Social Research of the Russian Academy of Sciences. Dr. Marsh's research interests center on communist studies and transition policies, with a focus on the former Soviet Union and China. His most recent book is Unparalleled Reforms: China's Rise, Russia's Fall, and the Interdependence of Transition, an examination of the divergent outcomes of the Soviet and Chinese attempts to reform their communist systems. Dr. Marsh's previous books include Russia at the Polls, Voters, Elections, and Democratization, and Making Russian Democracy Work: Social Capital, Economic Development, and Democratization. He's published articles in leading journals related to this field. When Professor Connor and I were putting together the lecture list for this, we contacted a number of people to make recommendations about whom we should invite. One of those inquiries went out to Peter Berger, and the name of Christopher Marsh came back immediately and without question as the one who should help us address the issues of religion, nation, and state in Russia and China. As we begin our consultations on this, we decided to focus on Russia, which will be the topic of Professor Marsh's lecture this afternoon. After the lecture, we'll have a time of discussion. And again, we thank you for joining us this afternoon, and please join me in welcoming Christopher Marsh to Middlebury College.
Thank you for that warm reception. Thank you, Professor Connor. Thank you, Professor Yarborough, and students, faculty, members of the community. Thanks for coming. Am I too loud with the mic? I can hear it reverberating in my ear. No? Sounds okay? All right. Initially, it was my charge to speak about these issues for the former Soviet Union and China, but covering about 1/5 of the world's population seemed a little daunting. So I decided to hold that for another discussion another time. However, if you would like me to comment during the question and answer period on China, I'd be more than happy to do so. I was actually speaking with Professor Connor today and after lunch about a large grant that I've just received with two of my colleagues, including Rodney Stark, called God and Country in the Middle Kingdom, where we're exploring these issues in the Chinese context, along with similar issues with Islam, Buddhism, national identity, state identity, and the demise of the communist ideology and its facade of a national and statist identity, I should say. Whether by plan or by chance, today marks the 20th anniversary of the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. I think that's a good point of departure for my talk today, and I'll try to connect it back to issues of religion, national identity, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the nature of the Soviet colossus in its economic and industrial sectors. As most of you are aware, and some of you I know might not be with your generation, the nuclear reactor, the number 4 at Chernobyl, exploded. It went into a meltdown after a failed test, actually, of the reactor on this day in 1986. And when all is said and done, probably about 100,000 to maybe 200,000 people lost their lives as a result of that accident. Though the initial Soviet figures were around 56 people dead, almost all of which were firemen who bravely went in to contain the fire. The disaster has had repercussions in terms of biological and ecological impact and radiation leaks throughout Europe, not just through Russia, and also, incidentally, through a lot of Belarus. Chernobyl is an excellent point of departure for my talk for a few reasons. First is that it was the first test of Gorbachev's reforms. Gorbachev became General Secretary in March of 1985, and here now, just a scant year later, after he had already begun discussing things such as glasnost, his willingness to actually stand up to this rhetoric he was putting out came. And I think he failed that test miserably. Instead of glasnost being about openness and public discussion and ability to debate, here the first test of that policy was one of clamping down and shutting down media outlets and denying what was going on. I think the thing that most frightened me as an undergraduate when I was reading works about this, particularly the work of Jeffrey Hosking, was that during this time period, when we look back on and say that Gorbachev was this great reformer and trying to distance himself from the patterns of the Soviet past, is that when they were evacuating Pripyat, the town that the people lived in who worked at Chernobyl, they went around and evacuated almost everyone. But the scientists had a play here, and one of the things they did was that certain increments, different sets of meters, 100 meters, 1,000 meters, 200,000 meters of distance from the zone, they would tell certain families, you don't need to evacuate. You can just stay put, and everyone will be back in a couple days. And they would monitor them to see how quickly they died and in what circumstances. This really symbolizes what the Soviet Union was, how inhumane it was, and how the purposes of science were sometimes put above that of humanity. And also the decrepit nature of the regime in its later years. But mostly what I want to emphasize here is that Gorbachev, the person who's hailed as this great reformer, was reluctant to reach the level that he was going to later on. It also shows the impact of history. I'm a political scientist and a sociologist of religion in my second training. But one of the things we don't really pay much attention to is the sweep of history, that events in history can just arise that change everything, and the policies and the concepts and ideas they've been working on formulating, that the history sometimes has its own ideas of what's going to unfold. And this gets back to the old debate in the 1800s, which between who made history. Does man make history? Does history make man? And of course, Marx had his own answer to that. But I think, in my mind, the anniversary of Chernobyl shows us that while someone like Gorbachev might have been there, these events of history and the sweep of history changed things. If it weren't for Chernobyl, the Soviet Union's final days maybe would have been quite different. I mean, we used to say in the old days, if it wasn't for Andropov's kidneys, if Yuri Andropov had stayed as general secretary, had he not died of kidney cancer, the Soviet Union maybe would have gone in a different direction. We can always talk about these counterfactuals, but I think all scholars of the former Soviet Union agree that Chernobyl was probably the first nail in the coffin of the Soviet Union. Once Gorbachev came to power, there was no real indication that the Soviet Union was going to come crumbling down within a mere 6 years. But with Chernobyl, it was the first real conflagration, really, of his attempt to reform and the impact of the Soviet system that was in existence and its really reluctance to be reformed. From another standpoint, Chernobyl is also an excellent point of departure, and that is the religious. I understand from some of the previous talks, religion hasn't been brought to the discussion as much as maybe it would have been hoped. My fear here is to maybe give you too much religion. I tend to scare off political science or sociologist audiences by actually bringing religion right to the discussion. The first slide I have relates to this. Here is the reactor as it looked after it blew up at Chernobyl before the sarcophagus was put back on, which incidentally is now leaking and they need to replace as well. But I'm going to show you some scripture. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp. And it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called Wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood. and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. A little reading here, the apocalypse from the book of Revelation. Why is this significant? In Ukrainian, the word wormwood is Chernobyl. So, in the minds of people in this part of the world, when this occurred, many people immediately thought back to the Bible, the biblical translation. Now, this is under some dispute because, in fact, if there's any scholars of plant genetics, you might point out that, in fact, Chernobyl is actually mugwort, or Artemisia vulgaris, as opposed to Artemisia absinthium. I guess there's a mistake here along the lines at some point, genetically, though they're related species of plant. But the word they used was Chernobyl for wormwood, even though it's only one variety of it. And as you read the passage, look at it now and think about bitter, and think about radioactivity, and think about men dying in the water that became corrupted by this. You start to see the possibility that was there to interpret the event through a religious prism. This happened. Serge Smeman, the great New York Times writer, was there at the time and wrote, a mere 2 months later, an article called Chernobyl Fallout, Apocalyptic Tale, where he discussed that, in fact, throughout Russia and the Soviet Union at the time, this connection between Chernobyl and wormwood in the book of Revelation was being connected. So here you have, and of course, let's back up for a second. I have to sometimes point things out that are obvious to me, but might not be obvious to others, is Chernobyl is not in Russia, right? It is in Ukraine. And Orthodox Christianity, which brings us the book of Revelation, came to Russia, or Moscow, via Kiev in Ukraine, with the baptism of Rus in the year 988 by Prince Vladimir, known as the Ravno Apostolny, or the equal of the apostles, as he's known by all Orthodox. So you take together these issues, Chernobyl, the biblical interpretation, Orthodoxy as having its roots here in Kiev, and then relate that back to now a national identity in Ukraine, where Ukrainians begin to feel that they are the ones being put at risk by these reactors. Incidentally, the Russians and their economy was fueled quite extensively from reactors in other parts of the former Soviet Union, including the one at Ignalina in Lithuania. For some reason, the Soviets would put these things in adjacent territories as opposed to some of the Russian heartland. So you start to see how these things can come together. It's not hard to imagine how in a country that had been subjected to 70 years of militant atheism, that religion could become a central interpreting factor in this process. In this year, 1986, the current party program of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, still listed religion alongside other vices, including alcoholism. So this is a society that had done its best to destroy religion. The reactor, by the way, was named, as most everything in Russia is named, Imena Lenina. So in the name of Lenin. So it's the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the name of Lenin, the first of the militant atheists. So you start to see how these things can all combine within this image. And that's how I kind of wanted to begin today's talk, was to look at the final days of the Soviet Union through this prism where nationalism, national identity, religion, and the Soviet colossus all come together to form a worldview that is integral but at odds with each other at the same time. As I understand it, my charge here today is to discuss the ways in which religion has interacted with ethnic, civic, and national identity in the post-Soviet world. Plan my talk in 3 stages. First, as a way of background, I'm going to give a little bit of a religious and ethnic and political background to the events as they unfolded in the Soviet Union's final days. Then I'll turn to the issue of political development in the post-Soviet space and the formation of new states and national identities and the revival of religion in those parts of the world. Finally, I'm then going to turn to some more original research of my own and discuss how the formation of a national identity often is strongest when it is juxtaposed to a distinctive religious tradition, or religious traditions other than its own. So the Chechen national identity, with an integral component being Islam, is more vociferously outlined when it's in contradistinction to neighboring Orthodox Christian identities. And likewise, with places like Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian national identity, Orthodoxy is seen as the central bulwark of the civilization that is there stuck and surrounded within the Muslim world. First, let me begin by discussing religion, ethnicity, and the collapse of the Soviet Union. One of the most difficult things in the USSR was trying to hold together a state comprised of so many different nationalities. Just to give you something to glance at, you all know that the Soviet Union was comprised of 15 different republics, but within these republics there was great ethnic diversity as well. And once the whole thing collapses and you're left with independent states, you still have this jostling of territories back and forth, such as Crimea, which is left in the hands of Ukraine, even though it had been historically Russian territory, and places such as in Estonia, around Ivangorod, a territory that is populated by Russians, but now is still part of Estonia. You have a lot of this search for state identities because the national group that exists, and in many cases is not even contested, does not coincide perfectly with the borders as articulated and outlined by the Soviet government. In some cases, meant specifically by Stalin to appease the minority ethnic groups, such as with Crimea in the situation there. Some of the nations, and I refer to them as nations because in fact they were nations, and you can use Professor Connor's definition here, they were not just ethnic minorities. They were self-efficacious nations, some of which had long histories dating back to, for instance, Armenia and its identity as a nation-state in the year 301, and not just as a nation-state, but as a Christian nation, the world's first Christian nation, beating out the Georgians by just a few years, and tracing their roots back to the Apostle Paul. So we're not talking here about new inventions of nation-states. We're talking about distinct ethnic groups with distinct religions, religious traditions, and ethnic backgrounds, and genetic composition. And we can name the Lithuanians, Latvians, Estonians, Georgians, Armenians, and the Tatars within Russia itself. Their numbers were in the millions, and they had very distinct linguistic backgrounds. These nations played a major role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. I always discuss the collapse of the Soviet Union in context with Eastern Europe. The collapse of the Soviet Union began in Eastern Europe. One of the big events, of course, was the summer of 1989, but for today's purposes, we're going to jump right to the fall of the Berlin Wall in November of that year, and then the execution of the Ceausescu family in late December of that year. The contained nations of the Soviet Union, in particular Lithuania, Georgia, Armenia, they watched what was going on in Eastern Europe and understood it through the prism of their own reality, which was that of a subjugated people under the Soviet thumb. And just as we, as college students back in my day, didn't make much of a distinction between the Soviet bloc in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, they were the same thing. And you could actually still get an A on a test by mistakenly referring to it all as the Soviet Union, pretty much, because Poland was, not independent of anything else. I think it's time for a joke here, Professor Yarborough, so I'll throw this one out there. The joke was always, how come in Prague the toilet paper was 2-ply, while in Moscow it was only 1-ply? Of course, because Moscow must receive a copy of everything. So the autonomy of Eastern Europe was not real. So everything in Eastern Europe had a direct mirror to that of these republics that were under the thumb of Moscow: Ukraine, the Baltics, the Caucasus. So when Lithuanians began watching what was going on in Eastern Europe, they understood every reason that was being presented for why Eastern Europe should have its own path to socialism as being equally applicable to their own situation. And that's why, within 3 months of the events of 1989, by March 1990, Lithuania declared independence. Incidentally, it comes back to nuclear power, too, because it was at that point that the Soviets weren't really ready to do much about it, but the the Lithuanian government started to dig into the ground and tap the oil pipeline that went through its territory, and they started to try to take control of the Ignalina nuclear power plant. And this led to kind of a stalemate because the Soviet economy was so integrated, there was nothing Moscow really could do to the Baltics. So for about a year, it was just on the table. The Soviets said, you're not independent, but then again, we're not exactly sure how we're going to figure this out. This whole situation finally came to a head with the August coup of 1991, in August 1991. The pretext of this coup, many of you have heard of the coup, I'm sure, but most of you probably don't realize that it happened one day before the signing of a new union treaty, a treaty that Gorbachev was hoping would keep the Soviet Union together, keep all these disparate nations into the single Soviet monolith. And of course, it was a reactionary group of, I don't know what you call them, you can't call them right-wingers because they're communists. We had this discussion, I remember a week later, we had a talk at my university at Central Connecticut, and what do we call them, right-wing, left-wing? Well, they were brown shirts, let's say that, okay, in that sense. They were in control of the government, not wanting to give up control of the government. They were nationalist. They were also communist. And they were very much against giving up autonomy to the other minority nationalities in the country. And this committee, of course, took control. Still debatable what role Gorbachev had in that when he was at his Black Sea resort. A new account came out saying that the day he was under house arrest, he had a nice little lunch and dinner with the neighbors, and his family walked down the street and dined with them. So there's some question as to whether or not he was actually, Gorbachev was taken hostage, or in fact he was just told, sit back and relax, we're going to get the Soviet Union back for you, and then don't mess it up this time. But the fact is, Yeltsin rose to the fore, and the nations engaged in what has been called the Parade of Sovereignties, beginning in this day, August 21st, 1991, through to December 31st, 91, New Year's Eve. You had a Parade of Sovereignties take place where the different constituent republics, these people, all declare themselves independent. Not all of them are wishing to do so initially, but once the parade began, it was hard not to join in. That left us at a different level, that of the Republican level, lowercase r. The republics within each of these countries also have minority groups. By a very conservative estimate, the number of ethnic groups within Russia today numbers 128. The largest, of course, are the Russians. The Tatars are second with about 5.5 million. And this goes all the way down to just a few thousand of such groups as Maksha and Mordva and other groups. What makes this composition so problematic is it's not a melting pot. It's more of a smorgasbord. A melting pot would have all these different foods in it, and maybe you would still see some whole carrots and some whole potatoes. But a smorgasbord does not usually, if they keep the thing clean, contain part of one food at the other part. And that's how Russia is, and that's how most of these republics were, which is there were distinct pockets of ethnic homelands that were the majority, where the majority population was a minority in the country. So if you go to Tatarstan, Russians are in a minority. If you go to Ingushetia, Chechen Ingushetia, at the time it wasn't broken up yet, you would find that Russians were in a minority. So there are parts of the Russian Republic, which would later be called the Russian Federation, where you could go, and these were homelands to where these people had lived for a long time, distinct languages, distinct ethnic groups, and Russians were a minority. Or if they were in a majority, it was because they had been there for 10, 20, 30, 50 years as part of Soviet industrial policy to send people out there, such as part of the Virgin Lands Project, to inhabit these territories. So there's a distinct territorial dimension to what was going on there. And this becomes relevant, as we discussed later on, the drive for statehood, because it's these groups that are the ones I'm mostly interested in looking at. The first cut is the cut when the cookie cutter of the Soviet Union breaks up and you have 15 independent countries. But the violence that really begins is when the groups below that level, at the Republican level, look and say, the cookie cutter didn't reach us, but we have a greater claim to statehood than some of the countries that got statehood. For instance, I say there's 5.5 million Tatars. That is more than there are Estonians. That is more than there are Lithuanians. That is more than there are Latvians. That's more than there are Armenians in Armenia. So notice I'm naming independent countries, but Tatars are numerically larger than them. And they have their own distinctive homeland. And they're quite distinct from Russians, as distinct as Georgians are, and some others. Let me jump ahead a little bit here. In these conflicts, these separatist conflicts, the drive for statehood, religion became intermeshed with the raison d'etre of this new nation. The justification for this new nation to exist and for this nation to achieve statehood became closely tied to religion. Let me explain what I mean by this. Many of the successor republics of the Soviet Union during the pre-communist period had religion as a central component to their national identity. Okay? I hope we can follow it's kind of wordy. Before the Soviet Union ever existed, religion was an integral component of Russian identity. Orthodoxy was an integral component of Armenian identity. Same for Georgia. And if we go over to Europe, it's no different from, say, Catholicism being a strong component of national identity in Poland, Italy, or Ireland. And notice here, and this is where I think a lot of people get confused, they think, well, how can the same religion be part of a national identity for such disparate groups? It can. We see that. Just tell a Pole and an Irishman that they're the same because they're Catholic, it's not going to get you as far as you might think. This leads me to one of my favorite jokes that Peter Berger tells, because Peter Berger, I don't know if he's written a book on humor. He's a very, very funny guy. The joke goes this way. Guy's walking down the street in Northern Ireland one night, and all of a sudden someone else comes up, puts a gun to his head, and says, "Quick, are you a Protestant or a Catholic?" He says, "Neither. I'm an atheist." He goes, "Yeah, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist?" This joke says so much about religion and national identity. And I think you have to come at the role of religion in national identity in the former Soviet Union from this perspective. I'm not talking here about theology. I'm not talking about pious individuals, though some are. Religion needs to be unpacked into its various constituent components, one of which is purely cultural and has very little, if anything at all, to do with religion. So the fighting is not over religious doctrine per se, but over the identity of in-groups and out-groups that are formed by some association with a religious tradition. So when I discuss religion, I don't always have in mind theology, but more of a cultural identity. And it doesn't even require theological belief. So today, there are many Orthodox atheists in existence, such as Belarus's leader, Alexander Lukashenko, who's called himself that. What I find more interesting, though, is Vladimir Zhirinovsky, a Jew who says he's also Orthodox of sorts because of his close affinity to the Orthodox religion. These things sound sort of impossible to make, but in their minds, it is there. And we get into different theoretical perspectives. From an instrumentalist perspective, we could say Zhirinovsky is just there spouting out rhetoric that will help him achieve his goals. Given that his best-selling book was on the climax, I can't say that he might not be doing that. But in other cases, these people may have some cultural affinity to orthodoxy that we really should not discount. Let's talk about our very good friend, Vladimir Putin, next. I'm going to jump this. This is about the collapse of the Soviet Union, the standoff in front of the White House. Here's our very good friend, Vladimir Putin, standing with the patriarch during his inauguration. Let's talk about his religious identity and religious commitments for a few seconds. On one level, Putin does seek to engage in a public religion, a public religiosity. Likes to be seen with the patriarch, definitely likes to be seen going to Orthodox churches on holidays and festivals. And unlike Yeltsin, he actually knows what he's doing. It reminds me of the, what's that this movie I'm thinking of? I like to refer to movies and literature and art. I'll refer to art later on. The one with Robert De Niro, where he is the psychiatrist. Analyze this, where at the end, where the guy walks into the Catholic church, right, and he sees the baptism, the holy water starts. It's nice to have a place to cool off. That was sort of Yeltsin going into an Orthodox cathedral. Really didn't have much of an idea which way to cross himself or what he did and that sort of a thing. Not so with Putin. Putin knows exactly what he's doing. He's very much at home in an Orthodox Christian setting. And he makes it, he very much engages in public expressions of religion, and he brings religion back into the public square in Russia. Congratulates elders. He meets with a patriarch and so forth. This, though, I don't know if we'd even need to talk about that as genuine religiosity. That could just be political rhetoric. But there's another side to Putin and his religiosity. When he was running for the presidency that Yeltsin gave him when he resigned, he allowed a few journalists, I think there were 8 of them, to get together and meet with him during certain time periods, and they compiled a book called At Pirva Litsa, in the first person, we translate it as. And in this, he recounts a story when he was at a dacha, his country dacha, and it caught fire, and his wife and daughter were inside. And he recounts this from a religious standpoint where he has kind of an epiphany and a return to his Christian beliefs, having prayed on that and feeling that God had intervened on his behalf to save his family. And from that point on, he says that he became a believer again, as opposed to Gorbachev, who incidentally said his grandmother attended church, and someone actually went to find out, and there was no church in the Soviet Union within like 100 miles of where his grandmother lived during that time period, so we don't know how that is. But this has been documented, okay? Putin did go to church and does go to church, but he has this more private side to his religiosity. What I think is more interesting, though, is something that's much, much out of the media, and that is he has a starets. He has a religious elder, someone who he turns to for advice, which is really kind of the vogue today in Russia. Good, devout Orthodox have some elder, usually a monk or a priest somewhere, they turn to for personal advice. So it's not actually Alexei that we need to talk to or turn to when we're trying to understand Putin's religiosity, but in fact, it is probably this elder who's behind the scenes and probably wields considerable influence over Putin's thinking on different issues. So in that sense, you see within Putin this public religiosity, the depth of which we can debate, and then what I think is a more pure, genuine religiosity there. Let me turn pages here for a second, make sure I have time. I want to cover a lot of stuff. You all know that during the Soviet era, the regime promoted its own Soviet identity, Homo Sovieticus, we could refer to it as, which was not a national identity. It was a cosmopolitan ideological identity, one that was seen as superior to any national identity because national identities were just the construct of the capitalist class and were useful to get armies onto the field to engage in the battles for the capitalists. Of course, I studied in Moscow. I know exactly how to say this stuff, right? That identity never took hold, really, which is actually very interesting if you want to talk about Yugoslavia, because in some sense, a Yugoslav identity had a better shot at taking hold. And to say why one as ideological, the Soviet identity, and why one as kind of a pan-national, Yugoslav, Southern Slav, had a better shot. It's an interesting discussion, though. It's also been said that there was only one Yugoslav, Tito. Everyone else was a Serb, Croat, Slovene, Macedonian, Montenegrin, even Vojvodinian, if you will. So, but these are the questions that interest Professor Connor and interest me, and hopefully I'm going to be able to shed some light on those today. I think one of the reasons Soviet identity never was able to take hold was the ideology was based upon was absolutely anathema to many aspects of traditional Russian culture. This is an argument I'm making in conclusion to my new book on parallel reforms, which incidentally I gave to the secretary to put in your library, so if any of you want to go read it, jump to the conclusion, that's where the juicy stuff is. Incidentally, I argue that's not the case in China, and that there's certain attributes of Chinese culture that make it more or less compatible with communism in some sort of mutated form. But in the case of the Soviet Union, the Soviet identity never held, and as soon as the Parade of Sovereignties began, there was a search for national identities, sometimes new national identities, where none had ever existed before, such as in Transnistria, or places like Abkhazia and Abjaria, where to talk about a national identity is somewhat problematic. But there's also a reinvention of what the national identity was in these successor states of the former Soviet Union. And in terms of being a social scientist and wanting to be able to generalize other contexts, we're stuck here in a problem, and this is why. Hobsbawm and Ranger, the authors of this kind of concept of the invention of tradition, would love the Soviet Union as a case because they had a blank slate to work with. All knowledge of the Soviet peoples come 1989 to 1992 was wrong. It was all fabricated. Anything that could have been published in that time period in the Soviet Union was only meant to espouse a Marxist perspective. So it's already tainted. So the invention of tradition is not taking place in a learned intellectual community, but in a community in which everyone knew what they'd been being taught over the years about these ethnic groups and regions was wrong and was just being put to the purposes of the Soviet state. So what better place to invent a tradition than in this context? Because there are no good books to go get your hands on. There's no real good facts that everyone knows. You're really inventing tradition from a tabula rasa. And that is exactly what happened to a great extent. This appeal to nationalism and the search to forge a new national identity took place in many parts of the former Soviet Union. In Ukraine, where a new national identity was articulated out of what had been a regional identity, and that's its own case to discuss because of the myriad factors involved there, such as industrial development and its impact, ethnicity, religion. They do not coincide easily to make that process so coherent as it was in other places, such as in Chechnya and Nagorno-Karabakh. My hypothesis is that if you look across the former Soviet Union, where religious difference exists between an ethnic minority and a majority population, given other factors that may be present, including territoriality, competition among elites, and an identity crisis, religion is likely to become an important component of national identity. Moreover, the battle for independence will be more virulently fought for, will be more bloody, and more protracted. So we can step back and actually look to see if this is the case, to test my hypothesis. Hopefully you're all following me. I tried to give you some background in terms of a general class that I would teach at Baylor, and now as a social scientist I'm going to give you some of the data and discuss it that I've been accumulating. Here you see the suffering that is due to separatist conflicts in the post-communist world, and I include the Balkans here. On the left you see the state. The next column over shows you the separatist region or regions that have attempted to leave that state. And I have a coding for how intense they were based on the casualties and the number of displaced persons. So this is all just kind of standard information, but just to give you a table to look at it. I'm going to make it more complicated in a second. Most of you, of course, have heard of these conflicts: Bosnia, Kosovo, Chechnya, Nagorno-Karabakh. I think after that, maybe I start losing some of you. Gorno-Badakhshan and Transnistria, Gagauzia, others you might not have heard of. Good reason. Well, one good reason being the media doesn't tend to cover them much, but the other reason being that the conflict levels were much lower. Transnistria and Gagauzia, low-level intensity, less than 1,000 casualties. So tends not to make Western headlines, though some of you maybe have heard of them. This is the dimension of ethnicity and religion to these conflicts. So put aside their intensity for a second, and you start to see what you have here in Nagorno-Karabakh. You have Armenians who are at war against Turkic Azeris. In the Srpska Krajina, this is this territory in the former Yugoslavia, where you had in Croatia, that Krajina, where the Serbs were fighting Croats, Abkhazia, Abjaria. Sometimes you see there's an ethnic distinction between the groups, other times not. Look at Ajaria. Ajaria is quite an interesting case. You have ethnic Georgians on both sides. But one group, the Ajar, converted to Islam a few centuries ago. So their only distinction to other Georgians is their religion, not their language, not anything else. There's some deep Georgian history in terms of the old empires, though, you can talk about. But by and large, we can say that they're the same peoples. And if you go down here, you get it. I'm not going to run through all of them for you, but I mean the big ones you know, right? Serbs versus Bosniaks, the Bosnians who had converted to Islam throughout the centuries, and according to the Serb perspective, have become infused with Turkic blood. I know Misha Glenny's already spoken. I don't know how much he spoke about that. Michael Sells, in his book called "A Bridge Betrayed," discusses this in great detail, and it's one of probably the strongest point of his book and what makes his book so important to the field. And one of the things I throw on the quiz for my students in my class on ethnicity and nationalism is what we call gynocide, what he's coined as a term gynocide, like gynecology. Gynocide, not to kill off a race, but to kill off a race via its women. We don't necessarily mean, he doesn't mean killing the women, but he actually means forcibly raping these women, impregnating them with Serb bloodline to re-Serbify them because they'd already been Turkified. This is not what Michael Sells believes. This is what he is recounting from what he has heard, what he has seen from people who have discussed this sort of thing. And the point that I also find interesting about this is that within the tradition of the Bosnian Muslims, if a woman is raped, she quite often will be ostracized from the rest of the community, therefore effectively eliminating her from any reproductive capacity for the nation. So to separate religion from that, where does religion and ethnicity stop? Or is it because they're Turks or they're Muslims? You go through a lot of the former Soviet Union and the Balkans, and the local people will not even distinguish between the word Muslim and Turk. To them, it's the same thing. And if you ask someone, are they Muslim? Yeah, they're a Turk. That's the response. It means exactly the same thing to them. You can't unpack it because in their minds, this is what you're talking about. So the fact Bosniaks are Turks, therefore they're Muslims. And to them, it's incomprehensible that a Bosnian could become Orthodox. And there are people who have done this. They say, well, I'm Bosniak, and they have dark skin or whatever, but they're Orthodox Christian. Well, if they look dark, they're still Turks, and they're still Muslims. You can't change that. In that sense, it becomes like an ethnos. Finally, here's the most controversial part of what I'm talking about. If you just put together these variables, you see a pattern emerge. That where there's great religious and ethnic difference, that's when human suffering is its worst. Remove one variable, remove the religious difference variable, and leave the ethnic difference variable at great, and you have low-level human suffering. So it seems, in using multiple cases, that when you look across the former Soviet Union, the post-communist world in the Balkans, these ethnic conflicts, this ethnic cleansing we're talking about, is not only ethnic. Religion's playing a serious role here. And just looking at it from a social science standpoint, religious difference becomes a very powerful predictive variable. Now I'll stop being so social scientific and move on to more interesting things, more qualitative discussion. This is the roof of a church in the Kremlin. Hopefully it's clear for you. At lunch, Professor Connor and I were talking about symbolism. If, like the two of us, you look at nationalism as something that exists within the consciousness of the nation, and not just as something that elites can kind of push around on people, you have to look at the real-life totems, the symbols that exist within that society that either consciously or subconsciously on a daily basis reinforce this Weltanschauung, this worldview that says, your friend, your enemy, this is who I am, this is who you are. You're saved, you're damned. These images exist throughout the world. Here is one. Notice the 3 large cupolas represents the Trinity. Notice the 12 other cupolas represents the apostles. notice the crescent under the cross. The crescent under the cross was put there, this is disputed, but the Orthodox Church believes it, after the 1552 victory over Kazan. Oops, hold on, I have to jump around and give it to you. This was an icon painted shortly after that time period. It's called the Church Militant and Victorious, and it hangs in the Tretyakov Galeria in Moscow, not too far of a walk from the Kremlin if you're ever over there and want to walk around. It's quite a large icon. I think it's a little, about that size as it stands here on the wall. I don't know if you can make it out quite well because it's not easily accessible over here in the States. I had to get a guidebook and actually, a guidebook I have and use it. I should have bought that big guidebook, but I was cheap. I got this little handheld one. What you see here is Kazan on the right burning. Kazan was an outpost of the Golden Horde, the Zolotaya Orda. This is the Mongol occupation of the Russian lands. That was their outpost. Here is the Third Rome, Moscow. Right? Because once 1453 happens, which is the fall of Constantinople, you now have Moscow as the Third Rome. When Rome falls in 410, we're okay, because you have Constantinople. When Constantinople falls in 1453, Christianity is okay, because we have Moscow. So here's Moscow as the Third Rome, the church still in existence. And you see the angels on the side of the Russians as they sack Kazan and return victorious. This is an image all Russians know. And it's also an image all Russian Muslims know. It's also an image that was incorrectly put on the front of Dmitry Pospelyevsky's book on the history of the church in Russia. He actually has it flipped. They didn't want to have the burning of Kazan on the cover, so they inverted it to have Moscow on it. Quite interesting. But this image is real. And these two images I've just shown you show quickly, both in the Russian Orthodox mindset and in the Russian Muslim mindset, relations between Orthodoxy and Islam are confrontational. And there's this concept, this idea of subjugation of the Muslim by the Orthodox. Now, historically, we do know that once Ivan the Terrible did conquer Kazan, they expelled a lot of the population, killed other parts of the population, and forcibly converted to Christianity the rest. So this is also a history that is known. So this exists in the popular consciousness. So it's actually amazing that Tatarstan and its drive for statehood was relatively quiet. And there are good reasons for it, and primarily it's because the leader attempted a more open approach to getting increased sovereignty and financial gain. And Yeltsin was willing to play ball with him, as is Putin. So their drive for statehood has not been as violent. I have to back up here. Let me see, because I want to go. There it is. Here's the last thing I want to talk about. This is a guy named Yevgeny Rodionov. Of course, that's Nicholas II in the back. This picture is going to be all I'm going to talk about for the end, I think. Yevgeny was killed in Chechnya in 1996. He was a 19-year-old foot soldier who was taken hostage by a rebel commander. Rebel from the Russian standpoint, freedom fighter from the Chechen standpoint, right? The story goes that he was forced to denounce his Christianity and to accept Islam, which he refused to do. Notice the Bible in his hand. The commander then beheaded him. Like many Russian mothers do, his mother went looking for him in Chechnya. And she actually got an opportunity to meet with Ruslan Khayakov, the guy who actually was the commander who beheaded him. And supposedly he retold this story to the mother. The mother then took it back to Russia, talked to the Orthodox Patriarchate about it, and said that her son should be canonized as a martyr. The church wanted nothing to do with it. This is 1996. But in 2004, the church acquiesced to popular sentiment and canonize him. This procession is from about 2002. And if you notice, these are icons, but a true icon can only be made by the church. These are not made by the church. This was made by a lay brotherhood. And these people put pressure on the Russian Orthodox Patriarchate to canonize him. And despite the fact that there was scant evidence to support the woman's claims, and whether or not that actually would warrant canonization anyway, are beside the point, the fact is this young man has been canonized. So the image of the war in Chechnya, in Russia today, is understood as one of Islam and Christianity fighting it out. This other group here, the people holding these banners are the ones that I really want you to look at for a second. You remember I began my talk by saying, when we say religion and nationalism, quite often we're not talking about theological disputes. Sometimes they don't even believe in God. Other times it's just part of their culture. This is what I have called Sashaism, drawing upon Robert Withnow's concept of Sheilaism. These kind of roughneck gentlemen who probably don't attend church all that often, but are quite involved in these sorts of gatherings. They help carry these banners and all the equipment at these processions and pilgrimages that the people go on. And they are nationalists. They're wearing black berets. They're not in the military. That is not any Russian military uniform they're wearing. That's their brotherhood uniform. To them, Russian national identity is intertwined with orthodoxy. These are also the same sorts of people who broke into the museum, the Statehood Museum, and desecrated the images that were desecrating Christianity. I mean, have you heard of the Sakharov Museum incident? I'll get into it during question and answer if you'd like me to. So you see, these are the images I'm going to leave you with. I'm going to spend about 2 more minutes and just wrap up why we see this pattern that I think is there of religious difference coinciding with the intensity and protracted nature of these conflicts. And this has not been very well received by some of my audiences. And that is this. In these two traditions we're talking about, Christianity and Islam, both are universalist religions. In other words, both claim to be applicable to all nations. Okay? Not like Shintoism in Japan. If you're not Japanese, you can't really be Shinto. Not in the true sense. It's a religion for the Japanese. Christianity is for all nations. Think of the Great Mission, the Great Commission. Right? Go and teach all nations. Make disciples of all nations. Get it? Make disciples of all nations. The religion is going to supersede national identity. Same thing with Islam. And they're very clear within Islam. There's been kind of gravitation throughout history between to what extent can it be forced or must it be done of kind of a free will and conscience. But they're universalizing religions. And to be Muslim supersedes being a Turk or hopefully a Kurd, if you are a Turk, or an Iraqi or Moroccan or Indonesian. Because these religions exist beyond and above the nation. In addition to that, since they are universalizing and universalistic religions, they have a place in their own tradition for non-believers. This is the controversial part. It's called hell within the Christian tradition. So if you are a true believing Christian, a devout Christian, and a conservative one at that, not likely a liberal one, your theology will tell you there's one place where the non-believer is going to go. That is hell. Therefore, that person's already been condemned to death by God. Any act on the battlefield of sending them there early is just God's will. It reminds me of the 12th century assassin who killed the Tibetan king, incidentally, who was cracking down on Buddhism. He did not like the power of Buddhism in Tibet at the time. And here's a great Buddhist. As this person broke into the king's chamber, took out a dagger, and lunged it into the king's heart, he said, "I'm speeding you along onto your next reincarnation." So in these acts, what you have going on is not truly murder in that sense. Because it's something that is, if not God's will, it's God's intent. God will do it anyway. you're just kind of speeding them along onto that next reincarnation or onto their eternal damnation. So the point I'm trying to make here is one of the reasons we may see such a protracted nature to these conflicts that have religious difference, such an escalation of the violence of these conflicts where religious difference exists, is that the position of the other is so clearly alien and in some senses damned by the believer themselves. Thank you.